On the 12th of April 2019, police officers of Montgomery County in the state of Maryland received a search warrant for house number 47 on Elm Street in the city of Silver Spring. The three-story house with white fence and well-maintained lawn differed in no way from other houses in this prestigious area. The owner of the house, 54-year-old Robert Clark, physics teacher at the local college, was not present during the search. He was in custody for tax evasion. What the police officers discovered in the basement of Clark's house prompted even experienced officers to request reinforcement and psychological support. According to the report of investigator Michael Green, who led the operation, none of the present officers were prepared for what they saw. Crime scene technician Sarah Jenkins, who had worked with the police for 26 years, later confessed in an interview, "I will never forget that smell, and those eyes that stared at us from the darkness." But what led the police to the house on Elm Street if Robert Clark was originally arrested for tax fraud? The story began 3 years earlier, and the central role was played not by federal agents, but by neighbors who began to notice oddities. Elm Street was considered one of the most prestigious and quiet areas of Silver Spring. The houses were passed down here from generation to generation. Most residents had known each other for decades. The appearance of Robert Clark in the year 2016 aroused some curiosity but no concern. The new neighbor seemed somewhat reserved but polite and educated. "He moved in May 2016, recalls Elizabeth Horn, a 72-year-old retiree who lives across the street. "My husband and I brought him a cake to welcome him. Robert thanked us and even invited us for tea a few days later. A normal person, somewhat nervous, talked a lot about his work. Nothing suspicious." Clark quickly found his way into the leisurely life of the area. He taught physics at the community college, led a scientific circle for high school students, and occasionally attended local events. The only oddity that the neighbors noticed was his excessive caution. Clark installed an advanced security system with multiple cameras and motion sensors at his house. The first unusual sounds were heard by neighbors about 3 months after Clark's move. Martha and James White, whose house was located 2 buildings away from house number 47, were the first to notice the strange sounds. "It wasn't really crying," James White clarifies, "rather a muffled sound, similar to a child's voice that monotonously repeated something. We thought it was the television or radio. It was around 11 o'clock in the evening. We were sitting in the backyard." The White family attached no significance to this. Enough families with children lived in the area, and the sound was not particularly loud or disturbing. A few weeks later, however, they heard a similar sound again, this time more clearly. "I was sure that the sound came from Clark's house," says James. "But he lived alone, had no children. I didn't even see guests with children come to him." By December 2016, the sounds had become regular. Now other neighbors heard them too, especially those whose houses were closer to Clark's house. The nature of the sounds also changed. What earlier sounded like monotonous speaking now often sounded like crying or sobbing. The sounds almost always began after 10 o'clock in the evening and could continue until dawn. "We started joking that Clark has a ghost in the house," recalls Teresa Gonzalez, the neighbor from the left side. "But the jokes quickly stopped when my husband clearly heard a child's voice calling, 'Help!' That was in February 2017, around 2 o'clock at night." The Gonzalez called the police, but the arriving officers found nothing suspicious. Clark was at home, let the police officers in, showed the main rooms. He explained that he had recently installed a home theater in the basement, and the neighbors might be hearing sounds from films. The police officers had no search warrant for the entire house and did not go down to the basement. After the police visit, the sounds stopped for several weeks. The neighbors decided that their concerns were unfounded, and the incident gradually fell into oblivion. In April 2017, however, Elizabeth Horn, while watering flowers early in the morning, noticed how Clark carried several large boxes from his car into the house. The boxes had holes, like for transporting animals, she recalls. "I thought he had gotten a dog or cat." When I asked him about it, he became noticeably nervous and said it was equipment for his laboratory. After that, he quickly went away. In the following months, the neighbors noticed further oddities. Clark began ordering significantly more food than one person could consume. Couriers regularly delivered packages. Garbage bags appeared in the yard, which Clark for some reason did not take to the local dump, but somewhere in his pickup truck. Most disturbing, however, was the resumption of the nocturnal sounds. Now it was definitely childish crying, claims Martha White, and not one voice. Sometimes it seemed as if there were several children there and they, I don't know how to say it more precisely, speak in their own language. The sound came from somewhere below, possibly from the basement. At the end of 2017, several families independently turned to the police again. This time the officers took the reports more seriously, but again found nothing suspicious during the inspection of Clark's house. The owner was polite, showed the basement, where there was indeed a home theater and a small scientific laboratory connected to his work. The investigator who conducted the inspection noted the excessive cleanliness and organization in the house, but this was no reason for suspicion. After the second police visit, Robert Clark became even more reserved. He stopped participating in public events, rarely left the house except for trips to work, and erected an additional fence in the backyard. The nocturnal sounds became quieter, but did not stop completely. We began to doubt our own sanity, confesses Teresa Gonzalez. Maybe it really were sounds from films, or maybe we developed collective paranoia. The police checked the house twice and found nothing. The situation remained unchanged for another year. The neighbors occasionally heard strange sounds but no longer called the police, as they saw no point in it. Robert Clark continued to lead a secluded life, but conscientiously taught at the college and violated no obvious laws. In January 2019, however, an incident occurred that changed the course of events. During a severe thunderstorm, a brief power outage occurred in the area. The security systems, including the electronic locks on Clark's house, were temporarily shut down. And precisely at this moment, the neighbors heard something that was impossible to ignore. On the night of the 24th of January 2019, a severe thunderstorm passed over Silver Spring. At 23:47, lightning struck a transformer that served several streets, including Elm Street. The power went out for 18 minutes. For most residents, this was only a minor inconvenience. For Robert Clark, it was a catastrophe. "I will never forget these screams," says David Gonzalez, Teresa's husband. As soon as the light went out, such a sound came from Clark's house, as if several children were screaming simultaneously, not from fear, but as if they had seen a chance and were trying to attract attention. The screams were so clear that practically all neighbors within a radius of 5 houses heard them. Some ran onto the street with flashlights to understand what was happening. In the darkness, they saw Robert Clark, who was running around his house in panic and checking doors and windows. He was screaming into the phone, James White remembers. Something like, "The system has failed. Come immediately. They could escape." When he noticed us, he immediately ended the call and ran into the house. After a few minutes, a black SUV without license plates drove into Clark's yard. 2 men in dark clothing got out of the vehicle and quickly went into the house. At this point, the screams had already stopped. The power was restored. 10 minutes after the strangers appeared, the SUV drove away after an hour. The next morning, the neighbors gathered in the White's yard and decided to call the police again. This time, they reported not only strange sounds, but also Clark's panicked reaction to the power outage and the visit of unknown persons in the middle of the night. Investigator Michael Green, who took the report, took it very seriously. He requested access to the surveillance camera recordings from neighboring houses and questioned all residents of the street. However, for a complete investigation, more substantial reasons were required than strange sounds and suspicious behavior. "We did not have sufficient evidence to obtain a search warrant," Green explains in his report. "Previous checks had revealed no violations. We began with covert surveillance of the house, and a review of Mr. Clark's past. The verification of Robert Clark's identity brought some interesting details to light. He actually had a doctorate in physics and an impressive career in the academic field. However, there was a 5-year gap in his biography. From 2011 to 2016, there was no information about him. Immediately before this period, he worked in a private research laboratory in Seattle, but quit without explanation. Another clue was the electricity bill. In the last 3 years, the power consumption in Clark's house exceeded the average level of the area by 4 times, even though he lived alone. Such consumption could be explained by operating energy-intensive equipment, for example, industrial refrigerators or life support systems. In mid-February 2019, Investigator Green received a call from Elizabeth Horn. The elderly woman reported that she had seen Clark carrying several large black bags out of the house deep in the night and loading them into his pickup. She managed to photograph this with her phone, although the quality of the images was poor. "I could not sleep and saw the headlight," Horn tells. "Robert was dragging these bags and they moved. I was afraid that someone might be inside them, and I took a photo." The examination of the images could not definitively confirm that there was a living being in the bags, but it strengthened the police's suspicion. Green applied for a warrant to track Clark's vehicle movements via GPS and received permission to install hidden cameras directed at his house from public territory. On the 1st of March 2019, the surveillance delivered the first serious result. The cameras recorded how Clark carried a small bundle that looked like a child wrapped in a blanket out of the house in the middle of the night and handed it to a masked person who was waiting in the same black SUV model that had come on the night of the power outage. The image quality did not allow us to say with certainty that it was a child, Green explains, but the size and shape of the bundle, as well as the extreme caution with which Clark carried it, prompted us to act immediately. The police began to pursue the SUV, but lost it in the industrial area of the city. Attempts to identify the owner through traffic surveillance cameras were unsuccessful. As it later turned out, the vehicle used technology to obscure the license plates. By mid-March, Investigator Green had collected enough evidence to apply for a search warrant for Clark's house, but decided first to find more direct evidence. He organized an unofficial visit by social services, who allegedly conducted a routine inspection of fire safety systems in the area. "I wanted someone to officially enter the house without advance notice," Green explains. "A social worker might notice something suspicious without alarming Clark." Maria Rodriguez, a social services inspector, visited the house number 47 on Elm Street on the 20th of March. Clark reluctantly let her in, but categorically refused to show her the basement, claiming that renovation work was taking place there and it was unsafe to be there. While Rodriguez checked the upper floors, she noticed several abnormalities. First, there was unnaturally much baby food in the refrigerator. Second, she saw children's clothing of various sizes in the guest room closet. Third, there were medical gloves and several syringes without needles on the kitchen table. The most disturbing observation Rodriguez made was when she passed the closed basement door. "I heard a rustling," is written in her report, as if someone was quietly moving in the room. And then a sound that sounded like childish murmuring, but very strange, indistinct. When she asked Clark if there were children in the house, he became nervous and said that sometimes his nephews came to visit and he kept things for them. The visit was quickly ended, but the information collected by Rodriguez was crucial for obtaining a search warrant. Before the police could act, however, another incident occurred. On the 28th of March, around 2 o'clock in the morning, the neighbors heard loud sounds from Clark's house. The sound resembled breaking glass, followed by a muffled child's scream. "I immediately called 911, says David Gonzalez. "The operator said that a patrol was on the way. But while the police were coming, I saw through the window how Robert ran out of the house, got in the car, and drove away at high speed. The arriving police officers found that the rear window of the house, which led to the basement, was broken. This gave them the legal right to enter the house without a search warrant to check for possible intrusion. The officers entered the house through the back entrance and began the inspection. In the basement, they discovered signs of struggle and small drops of blood on the floor that led to the exit. However, no persons or clear evidence of a crime were found. The house was placed under surveillance, and Robert Clark was put on the wanted list. His car was found abandoned 50 miles from Silver Spring, next to a bus station. The review of the records showed that a person resembling Clark had bought a ticket to New York. On the 5th of April 2019, Robert Clark was arrested at John F. Kennedy Airport as he tried to flee the country with a forged passport. Initially, he was arrested for document forgery and tax evasion, charges that were easiest to prove. This gave the investigators time to gather more serious evidence. After Clark's arrest, Investigator Green finally received a complete search warrant for the house number 47 on Elm Street. On the 12th of April, a team of investigators entered the house, and special attention was paid to the basement, the place from which the mysterious sounds had presumably come in the last 3 years. What the police officers saw when they went down the stairs forever changed their conception of human cruelty. The basement of the house number 47 on Willow Street consisted of 3 rooms. The first room, to which the steps from the ground floor led, was actually set up as a home theater and small laboratory, exactly what the police officers had seen during previous inspections. In this part of the basement there was nothing suspicious, except for an unusually solid metal door in the rear wall. This door seemed completely out of place in a residential house, Investigator Green remembers. Industrial steel, electronic lock, thermal insulation. Such a door would be expected rather in a research center or a bank vault. The keycards for the door were not found, but the forensic technicians were able to bypass the electronic security. Behind the door was a room of about 30 square meters, set up as a high-tech medical laboratory. The walls were covered with soundproofing material. Here stood computers, medical devices, refrigerators with medications and blood samples. On the tables lay notebooks, filled with formulas, graphics, and notes in Clark's handwriting. Most of the records were encrypted, but some pages contained comprehensible text, descriptions of experiments, observations, medication dosages. There was information about some subjects, numbered from 1 to 17, reports criminalist Sarah Jenkins. Descriptions of reactions to various stimuli, behavioral changes after the administration of preparations, measurements of brain activity. Everything seemed like scientific research, but conducted with obvious violation of any ethical norms. However, the most disturbing thing was discovered behind the third door. In contrast to the stable metal door between the first and second rooms, this door was made of ordinary wood, with a small window of reinforced glass. 6 heavy locks hung on it. Behind this door was a room that was described in the police report as a detention cell. The approximately 40 square meter room was divided into sections by transparent partitions. Each section contained a bed fixed to the floor, basic sanitary facilities, and a feeding station, similar to those used in zoos. In 3 sections there were people at the time of the search, but not those whom the officers had expected. We were prepared to find kidnapped children, judging by the sounds that the neighbors had heard, says Green. Instead, we found adults, but in an extremely unusual condition. In the first section was a man of about 30 years, in the second a woman of about 25, in the third another man, older, possibly 40 to 45 years old. All 3 had the physical characteristics of adults, but behaved like small children. When the police entered the room, they showed neither fear nor surprise. Instead, they began to make sounds that resembled the babbling of small children trying to speak. They moved awkwardly, as if they could not fully control their bodies. I've been working for the police for 26 years, and that was the strangest thing I've ever seen, confesses Jenkins. These people were physically adult, but behaved like children under 3 years old. They were not imitating, they actually behaved as if their minds had been altered. The medical team called to the crime scene confirmed that all three were under strong psychopharmacological influence. They showed traces of numerous injections, chronic malnutrition, and a prolonged stay in a closed room. According to preliminary estimates, they had spent at least 2 years in the basement. The identification of these people became the priority task. In the detention room, there were no personal items or documents. Only a sign with a number and a date hung on each section. Subject 4, 06-2017. Subject 9, 11-2017. Subject 13, 03-2018. In the laboratory, medical records were found for each subject. They contained information about vital signs, performed procedures, and administered preparations. However, the most shocking were Clark's notes about the progress of regression and the mental reduction to the childlike state. Judging by these records, Clark deliberately tried to return adult people to a childlike state, explains Dr. Eleonora Fisher, a psychiatrist brought in for the investigation. He used a combination of psychotropic medications, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and experimental techniques that we do not yet fully understand. During further examination of the laboratory, hundreds of hours of video recordings were discovered. On them, Clark conducted sessions with the subjects, administered various preparations to them, and conducted experiments on perception and memory. The recordings were dated from June 2016, practically immediately after his move to Willow Street. In one of the safes, the investigators discovered personal documents of the subjects. These were people who had been missing in various states over the last 3 years. Subject 4 turned out to be Michael Dorsey, a 32-year-old programmer from Chicago who had disappeared during a business trip to Washington. Subject 9 was Sarah Klein, a 26-year-old nurse from Baltimore who had disappeared on the way home from work. Subject 13 was Thomas Baker, a 43-year-old homeless man from Philadelphia, whose disappearance no one had reported. Clark deliberately chose people who either would not be searched for or would be searched for far away from Silver Spring, notes investigator Green. Most victims were loners, without strong social ties, traveled frequently, or led an irregular lifestyle. However, the most disturbing discovery awaited the police in the far corner of the laboratory. In a separate refrigerator secured with a code lock, tissue samples were stored that were labeled as subjects 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17. Forensic pathologists confirmed that these were human tissues. Basically, we found evidence that at least 17 people had passed through Clark's laboratory, explains Green. Where the remaining 14 are and what happened to them, that became the main question of the investigation. A partial answer was found in Clark's notebook, where he described in detail the completion of experiments with unsuccessful subjects. According to these records, many test subjects could not withstand the procedures applied to them. Some died from an overdose of the preparations, others developed irreversible brain damage, still others showed unacceptable forms of regression. They became aggressive or completely lost the ability to care for themselves. He probably took away the bodies of the unsuccessful subjects in those bags that the neighbors had seen, suspects Green. We found records of trips to remote areas of Shenandoah National Park. We have initiated a search operation there. The 3 survivors were taken to a specialized medical clinic. Their condition was assessed as physically stable, but psychologically extremely severe. An initial examination revealed that they had been exposed to prolonged exposure to a combination of potent psychotropic substances, many of which were not approved for clinical use. These preparations literally rewrote the chemistry of their brain, explains Dr. Fisher. They are not pretending to be children. They actually perceive the world with the cognitive abilities of a 3-year-old child. At the same time, they have retained some motor skills of adults, which creates an eerie dissonance. With the decryption of Clark's records, it became clear that he was conducting experiments on mental regression. He was trying to return the adult brain to a childlike state. The motives for these experiments remained unclear until the investigators discovered a personal diary that was hidden in a hiding place behind a bookshelf in Clark's bedroom. The diary shed light on the story of a man whom the neighbors simply considered a reclusive scientist. Robert Clark's diary began with an entry from the 4th of September 2011, a date that coincided with the beginning of a 5-year gap in his official biography. Today I lost Emily. The doctors say there is no hope. Her brain is irreversibly damaged. My girl is now just a shell. But I know she is still in there. I will find a way to bring her back. Emily Clark, the 7-year-old daughter of the suspect, died in the year 2011 in a car accident, explains investigator Green. She lay 3 months in a coma before Clark made the decision to discontinue life support measures. The following entries in the diary revealed the story of a person obsessed with grief who refused to accept his daughter's death. Clark began using his scientific experience to study the work of the brain, neuroplasticity, and possibilities for restoring cognitive functions. Initially, he acted within the framework of the law. He worked in research centers and cooperated with scientists who studied brain injuries. But in the year 2013, the tone of the diary changes. Clark writes about the stupidity of official science, ethical restrictions that break progress, and the necessity to act independently. He mentions a theory that became the basis of his subsequent experiments. If it is impossible to restore the damaged brain of an adult, it might be possible to return it to a more plastic, childlike state and begin restoration from there. Essentially, he was trying to find a way to neurochemically reset an adult's brain to the state of a child, explains Dr. Fisher. In his distorted logic, this should create a blank slate on which the personality of his deceased daughter could be restored. In the year 2014, the diary entries become more concrete. Clark writes about the first experiments on animals, conducted in the garage of a rented house in a suburb of Seattle. He describes medication combinations that show encouraging results in reducing cognitive functions to a primitive state. By the year 2015, he moves to field trials on humans. The first victims are homeless people whom he lures with the promise of food and money. In the diary, he describes coolly how he administers preparations to them and observes their reaction. Most of these early subjects die from an overdose or unforeseen side effects. At this time, he still had no suitable place for the long-term accommodation of test subjects, notes Green. According to the records, he simply disposed of the bodies by throwing them into Puget Sound Bay or burying them in the forest. In spring 2016, Clark decides that he needs a permanent base for his experiments. He sells his house in Seattle, buys a new home in the quiet area of Silver Spring, and sets up the basement as a laboratory. In the diary, he plans in detail the conversion of the room, the security system, and soundproofing methods. Parallel to setting up the laboratory, Clark develops a more sophisticated experimental protocol. He writes about 3 phases of regression. First, the personality breakdown through psychological pressure and pharmacological influence. Then, the cognitive regression with the help of special preparations. And finally, the imprinting, the implantation of new basic skills and behavioral patterns. At this point, he had already far exceeded the boundary of simple madness, comments Dr. Fisher. He created an entire pseudoscientific methodology with graphs, tables, and an evaluation system. It was crazy science, but carried out with frightening methodology. In the records, after the move to Silver Spring, Clark regularly mentions his subjects, their progress or failures. He describes how he improves his methods, changes dosages, and combines preparations. By the year 2018, he believes that he has achieved stable mental regression in several test subjects. Subject 9 shows consistent signs of cognitive functioning at the level of 30 to 36 months. We read in an entry from November 2018. She recognizes simple shapes, uses basic language, and shows age-appropriate emotional reactions. Preparation for the third phase is complete. The third phase was, according to the diary, the most sinister part of Clark's plan. He intended to load the memories and personality of his daughter into the regressed adults. For this purpose, he collected Emily's DNA from preserved personal items, studied neurotechnologies for memory stimulation, and experimented with psychedelic substances that he believed could open the mind for imprinting. The ultimate goal was not just to return adults to a childlike state, explains Fisher. He wanted to create an empty vessel that could then receive his daughter's personality. Basically, he wanted to recreate Emily in another person's body. Clark never achieved this goal. His experiments led to various forms of regression, but none of the subjects became the perfect vessel. Some lost all cognitive functions and fell into a nearly vegetative state. Others retained fragments of their adult personality, which Clark called contamination. A third group developed unforeseen psychotic symptoms. In January 2019, after a power outage and an incident that almost led to the escape of these subjects, the tone of the diary changes. Clark writes about the inevitable discovery and the necessity to complete the work or relocate to a safer place. The last entry is from the 27th of March 2019, one day before his escape. Tomorrow, I relocate S9. She is closest to the goal. The others are failures. I must separate myself from them. It is too risky to keep them here. White has called the police again. The house is being watched. I must act quickly. Clark could not fully implement exactly this entry.
Apparently, he planned to eliminate 2 remaining subjects and bring the most successful woman to another location, but an unknown incident, possibly an escape attempt by one of the subjects, led to a broken window, a police emergency call, and Clark's hasty departure.
Parallel to examining the diary, the investigators processed other evidence. The GPS tracker on Clark's car, which was installed in February, made it possible to reconstruct his routes of the last 2 months. Regular trips to a remote area of Shenandoah National Park aroused particular interest. On the 18th of April 2019, a search group with tracking dogs discovered several shallow graves in this area. In the following 2 weeks, the mortal remains of 7 people in various stages of decomposition were found. Forensic pathologists determined that all died from similar causes, a combination of preparations that caused cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. These people were Clark's failed experiments, says Green. When they no longer met his criteria or their accommodation became risky, he disposed of them. The identification of the corpses took several months. 5 of the 7 victims could be identified. They were people who had been reported missing in various eastern seaboard states in the last 3 years. 2 remained unidentified, presumably homeless people whose disappearance no one had reported. Crime scene technicians also discovered blood traces in the trunk of Clark's pickup that belonged to at least 3 different people. The analysis revealed that these were subjects, 10, 15, and 16. Probably the last victims Clark had disposed of shortly before his escape. The investigation of the black SUV that had been observed by neighbors remained impossible for a long time. The vehicle could not be found. At the end of April, however, the police received an unexpected tip. A farmer from Northern Virginia reported an abandoned vehicle that was found in a wooded area next to his property. It was exactly this SUV, and inside were found blood traces that belonged to Subject 9, the woman Clark regarded as his most successful experiment. We suspect that he tried to bring her to another location, but something went wrong, explains Green. Possibly she tried to escape or her condition deteriorated. He left the car behind and disposed of her in another way. By July 2019, the investigation had yielded evidence of Clark's involvement in the kidnapping and killing of at least 14 people. 3 survivors remained in a specialized medical facility, where doctors tried to lead them out of the state induced by chemical preparations. However, not all threats in this case could be connected. The identity of the visitors in the black SUV who came to Clark on the night of the power outage and later remained unclear. The fate of Subject 9, the woman Clark had brought out of the house shortly before his escape, also remained unknown. And most importantly, the investigators could not find out whether Clark acted alone or had accomplices. The answers to these questions could only be found in the head of Robert Clark himself. But getting them proved to be not simple. After his arrest, Robert Clark refused to testify. During the first interrogations, he maintained complete silence and stared at a point on the wall. A psychiatric assessment classified him as mentally competent, capable of understanding the nature of the charges and participating in the court proceedings. But Clark continued to remain silent. It was not tactical silence on the advice of his lawyer, explains investigator Green. He simply shut down, as if he had decided that the outside world no longer deserved his attention. The only time Clark broke his silence was on the 14th of May, 2019, when the investigators showed him photos of 3 surviving subjects. He looked at the pictures, and a grimace of disgust flashed across his face. "Failures. They are all failures," he said, and fell silent again. Despite the lack of cooperation from the suspect, the investigations continued. The investigators methodically reconstructed his movements of the last 3 years, questioned former colleagues, and analyzed financial transactions. Gradually, a more complete picture emerged. It turned out that Clark received funds from several sources. Besides his lecturer's salary, larger sums regularly came into his accounts from anonymous donors through offshore companies. FBI experts suspected that these could be payments from private individuals or organizations interested in the results of his experiments. "We found encrypted correspondence on one of his computers," reports FBI Special Agent Alice Kimura. Clark sent progress reports to someone with the code name Sponsor. In response, he received not only money, but also methodological recommendations and sometimes concrete requests for certain types of experiments. The attempts to track the mysterious sponsor have so far been unsuccessful. The messages passed through several encryption levels and proxy servers in different countries. However, analysis of the correspondence content suggests that the sponsor possessed fundamental knowledge in neuropharmacology and had access to experimental preparations. This was confirmed by the detailed analysis of the substances found in Clark's laboratory. Some of them were not registered in any pharmaceutical database and represented modified versions of known psychotropic medications. Such modifications required special equipment and expertise that Clark, despite his education, could hardly have possessed alone. "We are not dealing with a crazy loner, but with a more complex system," suspects Agent Kimura. Clark was probably an executor, a field researcher who worked for someone who provided resources and possibly scientific foundations. The theory about possible accomplices received additional confirmation when forensic technicians discovered a logo on the inside of the metal door in the basement that did not correspond to any known company. The symbol represented a stylized figure, reminiscent of a person in a diamond shape, as well as the abbreviation RMI. "We cannot yet decode this abbreviation," says Green, but the same symbol was engraved on some instruments in the laboratory and encrypted in file names on Clark's computer. Parallel to the investigations into Clark's activities and the search for his possible accomplices, work with the 3 surviving victims continued. Their condition improved slowly, but progress was minimal. The problem lies not only in the pharmacological impact, although this was unprecedented, explains Dr. Fisher. These people were subjected to a complex set of psychological manipulations. Clark literally erased their personalities and partially replaced them with artificial constructs. This is nothing one can simply wean off or heal from. By July 2019, Subject 4, Michael Dorsey, began responding to his correct name and recognizing family members and photos. Subject 13, Thomas Baker, regained basic self-care abilities but remained unable to speak coherently. Subject 9, Sarah Klein, showed the least progress and remained in a state that psychiatrists described as cognitive functionality at the level of a 2 to 3-year-old child. Their brain has literally restructured under the influence of the preparations, explains neurophysiologist Dr. James Cho. MRI shows changes in the activity of various brain areas, a reorganization of neural connections. In a certain sense, they are no longer the people they were before their kidnapping. In August 2019, there was a new lead in the case. An anonymous informant contacted the FBI and claimed to have information about the Institute for Regressive Medicine, an organization that conducted similar experiments to Clark. According to the informant, the abbreviation RMI stood precisely for Regressive Medicine Institute. This person claimed that the institute is funded by a group of wealthy people, many of whom have lost children and are obsessed with the idea of bringing them back, reports Agent Kimura. But before we could organize a meeting to obtain more detailed information, he disappeared. The attempts to track the informant remained fruitless. His email was created through an anonymous service and the IP address changed regularly, indicating the use of advanced methods for identity concealment. On the 8th of September 2019, another unexpected event occurred. Sarah Klein, Subject 9, was found dead in her room in a specialized clinic. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest due to a previously undetected congenital pathology. However, toxicological analysis revealed traces of the same experimental preparation in her blood that Clark had used. How the preparation entered her organism under strict medical observation remains unclear, notes Green. Surveillance cameras in the clinic corridor recorded the blurred image of a person in medical clothing who entered Klein's room 3 hours before her death. This person was not identified among the clinic staff. Sarah Klein's death led to increased security measures around the 2 other survivors. They were moved to a closed federal medical facility with witness-level protection. In October 2019, the trial against Robert Clark began. He was charged with kidnapping, illegal imprisonment, conducting illegal medical experiments, abuse and murder. In total, 17 charges, each of which meant a life sentence. Clark continued his line of behavior, complete silence and no reaction to what was happening. His court-appointed lawyer tried to build the defense on insanity, but psychiatric assessments consistently classified the defendant as mentally competent. He is not insane in the traditional sense, explains Dr. Fisher, who appeared as an expert in the trial. He is fully aware of his actions, their consequences, and their illegality. His experiments were methodical, well thought out, with clear goals. This is not the behavior of a person in a psychotic state. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury announced guilty on all charges. On the 12th of December 2019, Judge Richard Holden sentenced Robert Clark to 17 life sentences, without the possibility of early release. During the sentencing, another strange incident occurred. When the judge announced the decision, Clark reacted for the first time during the entire trial. He smiled and said a sentence that only those near him heard. "You think you have stopped us? This is only the beginning." 3 days after the sentencing, Robert Clark was found dead in his cell. The preliminary cause of death was acute heart failure. During the autopsy, no traces of poison or other suspicious substances were found in his body. Nevertheless, the circumstances of his death were added to the list of strange coincidences in this case. At the beginning of 2020, the condition of the 2 surviving victims continued to improve slowly. Michael Dorsey regained his speech and some basic memories of his former life. Thomas Baker reached a cognitive functioning level corresponding to an 8 to 9-year-old child. A complete recovery is unlikely, Dr. Cho remarks cautiously. but the progress they have achieved can already be considered a medical miracle, given what they had to go through. The investigations regarding possible accomplices of Clark and the mysterious organization RMI continue. The FBI has formed a special working group that deals exclusively with this aspect of the case. Agent Kimura, who leads the group, refuses to comment on the current status of the investigations. The house number 47 on Elm Street was confiscated by the state and later demolished by decision of the city administration. In its place, the construction of a memorial park in memory of the victims is planned. The neighbors, whose vigilance ultimately led to Clark's exposure, still have mixed feelings. "We lived next to a monster for 3 years," says Elizabeth Horn. "We heard the screams of his victims every night, and we could do nothing until it was too late for many of them. This feeling will never leave us."